Hey everyone, Mike here. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up and a preamble for this first episode that we're doing for our July break. This is the IRCB Movie Club, a Patreon exclusive series that we've been doing since March of 2020. Paul, Brian, and I sit down and talk about movies that are somewhat related or completely adapted from comic books. It's been a really exciting series. We allow folks to vote on the episodes after the first episode as to what we're going to be talking about next. And this first one is quite a doozy. We're talking about Ghost World, one of Paul's favorite movies, I think. And Brian and I have some interesting thoughts. But if you're interested in the rest of the series, make sure you check them out on Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. And I hope you enjoy it.
Please silence your cell phones, cease the needless chit-chat. It's time for the movie to begin. Welcome to the IRCB Movie Club. I am your host, Paul Jasley, joined by Mike Rapin.
Hello.
And Brian Murray.
Hi.
Welcome to the theater, guys. This is the inaugural episode of this podcast we're going to try. This is an idea I had and I pitched to Mike, so we're going to see how it goes. I want to talk about comics and movies, how they intersect, the differences between the mediums, movies about comics, movies that are adaptations of comics, movies that inspired comics. Two of my favorite things to talk about, so I figured why not do it in one podcast. And we're going to start off with the inaugural episode talking about Ghost World, the 2001 film directed by Terry Zwigoff and adapted from the comic written by Daniel Clowes. This came out in 2001. As I mentioned, the comic was originally published in Daniel Clowes' series 8 Ball. Between the years 93 to 97, it was serialized, and we'll get into it deeper, but just to start off the conversation, I'm going to say this is probably the most successful comic book adaptation into a film that I've seen, and that's why I want to talk about it. Guys, what do you think about the movie Ghost World and as an adaptation?
I'm just going to jump right in and say I feel like this movie captured the same feeling that the Ghost World comic tried to put off, but as an adaptation, I don't think that it works in the latter third of the movie.
Interesting.
Up until a certain point in the movie, I feel like it works. There's natural changes that need to be made because of, it's a movie. Mm-hmm. But I do feel like, on the whole, it's not as great of an adaptation as maybe Paul thinks.
Okay.
So more to say on that later, I think.
Okay. Yeah, Brian, what are your thoughts initially?
Yeah, I tend to be in the same vein. I thought that the weird Steve Buscemi chicken manager
right
story arc, I'm not sure what it was doing in the movie, I guess.
Okay.
Because the book didn't have a character anything like that. We had the mystic or whatever his career was,
right? Yeah,
who was just kind of like filling that role of creepy old dude. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it seemed like a strange thing to materialize.
Yeah. I guess very briefly for anyone that hasn't seen Ghost World, the sort of, I guess, elevator pitch of the movie and the comic is that it's about two teenage girls who had just graduated high school and they're kind of adrift and aimless, trying to find their place in the world. The comic, like a lot of Daniel Clowes comics, has a sort of a very like esoteric, idiosyncratic sort of vibe to it. There's a sort of aimlessness to the story that works in the comic that really wouldn't translate to a film. And I think that's why the movie, expands the Steve Buscemi character into a larger role. It introduces a sort of more digestible idea of a plot than the comic has. Mm-hmm. And I think for me personally, why I say it's a successful adaptation has more to do with the aesthetic quality than maybe the plot, because Daniel Clowes' comics have a unique sort of a strangeness to them. There's a pacing sense that he has that's very unique. The way that he sort of creates a mood in the comic, and that's the hardest thing to translate, I think, is that sense of pacing and mood from a comic to a film, and that's what the movie does successfully for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I absolutely got that same feeling. Like, I think it's, like I said, in the first 2/3 of the movie, I think that all exists, mm-hmm. and in order to make the movie more of a cohesive movie, they add different storylines. Like the Steve Buscemi storyline kind of comes to the forefront by the halfway point in the movie, but you've also got Enid going to art school. We haven't said it, we're a couple minutes in, full spoilers for this series and this movie that came out over 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. But Enid going to art school, Steve Buscemi's character becoming this chicken manager, as Brian said, and he's got this art. I think that you put those into the movie to make them a more cohesive movie. As I watched the movie, I didn't realize that it came out in 2001. To me, this felt like a movie straight out of 1997.
Okay. Yeah.
If only because it had all of the trademarks of, okay, we need to create this thing and then wrap it up, and then create this thing and wrap it up, and create this thing and then wrap it up. It's something that I feel like in a modern day retelling of this story, I think if you made this movie in the 2010s, they would have been way more vague. They would have been more comfortable with being super vague about some things. Sure. Like maybe you wouldn't have needed to wrap up the Steve Buscemi storyline, because you kind of just you play off the idea that Enid in general, and kind of Becky to a certain point, but like she's just aimless. Like things just happen and she just lets them happen, and then she moves on, and she's so aimless about it, and she's so directionless that it doesn't matter. Like all of these people are affected by her, and like there's a wake, and so you wouldn't even get the resolution of the Steve Buscemi storyline. Instead, it would just disappear.
Right.
So I don't know. I think like there were some things that I couldn't I couldn't enjoy in the movie because it felt like they had to wrap things, or they felt the need to wrap things up when it didn't really need to happen. I mean, the end of the movie is kind of ambiguous. She does the thing that she says, but like where is she going to go? Right. We don't know, because that's the end of this like particular moment in her life. Yeah, I don't know. I've been digesting a lot of this over the last couple of days, because I read the comic and then that same night I watched the movie.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I've got a lot of this stuff super fresh in my head, or when I was watching the movie, had a lot of things super fresh in my head. Like specific lines come out of the comic right into the movie, which I really appreciate, because in the comic they're classic lines, and I appreciated that about the film for sure. But yeah, I'm rambling now.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, it's interesting that you referred to Enid having a wake. I probably would have used the term trail of destruction.
Yeah.
Because her modus operandi in both the comic and the book seems to be, go to a thing and ruin it, and then move to the next thing and ruin that. And I think that the comic is much more successful in showing that she doesn't necessarily like that about herself. Whereas in the movie, I just don't think it comes through quite as well through acting as it does through the artwork in the book.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other piece of discussion I think we could have about Scarlett Johansson and Thora Birch in this movie, because I have had a couple problems with the way that they were either directed. But anyway, sorry to continue your point, Brian.
Yeah, it's just that in the movie, Enid seems much more unrepentantly mean.
Yeah.
That's true. In the book, where you really get the sense that she doesn't know why she's being so mean to people.
Right.
Whereas in the movie, it's just because she thinks it's funny, and she's going to keep doing it, God damn it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a very quick sidebar here. I'm curious to know when the first time you both saw the movie and read the comic, to give a sense of like, what we're talking about here. Because for me, I saw this movie shortly after it came out. So I was probably like 19. So I found myself identifying with those characters very heavily, because I was about in the same boat in my life, and in my personal aesthetic and approach to the world was pretty similar to Enid at that point, for better or for worse, So the movie really hit home for me. And then reading the comic was a very interesting experience, because it was kind of like the first... I hadn't read Daniel Klaus before that, so it was my first introduction to that. And he is one of my favorite cartoonists, and as much as I like his stuff, it's almost kind of hard to read because it is so like personal in a weird strange way. So going back now and rewatching that movie, 19 years later, rereading the book after a few years and having read a lot of Klaus stuff, having that distance and being older really changed my opinion of it. At the same time, I still found myself enjoying it. So I guess I'm just curious what your guys' history with this material is.
Yeah, I read this, or I should say, reading this for the first time was a thing that happened recently, I guess. That's a weird way to say that. I picked this book up. I'd seen it a million times because in high school, I want to say like maybe 2004, 2005, this was like a big thing, like among some of the friends that I had, and this movie like really shocked them. They're like, "Oh man, these people are exactly like us. They don't give a living shit about anything." And I remember feeling this kind of like understanding about that. And I remember being, I will say, like, when I think I was like 16 or 17 years old, I was very bored by the movie. And so coming out of it, I was just like, yeah, all I remember from that movie, watching it maybe 15 years ago or so, was that Scarlett Johansson was just like this deadpan character. And I like Steve Buscemi a lot, but he felt like a creep. And I mean, that story is still there, right? Like, a lot of that stuff is still there.
Yeah.
But I think since then, I've watched a lot of different other movies that allow me to appreciate the type of film that Ghost World is. Obviously, reading comic books and understanding where this movie's coming from helps as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hadn't read the comic until recently, but I had seen the movie, I think, twice when I was younger, and I don't remember liking it at all.
Okay.
And not understanding why people had such a big fan. And I'm not trying to poo-poo on you by any means, Paul.
Yeah.
That was my feeling. And going into it again, I did like it a lot more than I think the first time I saw it.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I saw the movie for the first time 3 days ago.
Okay.
And read the comic for the first time yesterday. So it's all very, very recent for me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You know, that first exposure to it, and watching it as a teenager is, like I said, a very different experience than watching it as an adult. So.
Yeah, because I think that watching it as a 31-year-old, I definitely had a very different experience.
Right. Yeah. Those goddamn kids, they're so disrespectful.
I mean, I spent most of it just being like, why are you being so fucking mean to people?
Yeah.
Well, so maybe that's one of the themes of the movie I want to talk about is this idea that Enid, specifically in the movie, I think in the comic, like you said, Brian, it's more ambiguous, what her personality is and what her place in the world is, but that the directionless that she feels in the movie comes off as misanthropy, which is a pretty common theme in a lot of Daniel Klaus's work. A lot of his work is autobiographical, it seems, and it's no mistake that Enid Coleslaw is an anagram for Daniel Klaus. He is that character, basically. But
I did not know that.
Does that blow your mind?
Paul, hold on. I have to reevaluate my entire thought process now. No, I had no idea about that.
So, I mean, but that's common in a lot of his work. I think he does kind of self-project onto the page a lot, and most of his characters are misanthropic, but in the movie, it comes off as mean-spirited, but I think, she's grasping for a personality. That's why you see her dye her hair. That's why you see her change her outfit so much, change her glasses. She's trying out different personalities to find the right one. And she's looking for a sense of authenticity, like something real. And I think the way that they contrast that with the Seymour character, the Steve Buscemi character, is that he's found his niche. He loves old jazz and blues records. He collects old stuff. He loves old pop culture. He feels out of place with the world, which is why Enid sort of, identifies with him. But he's miserable because of it,
Right.
And I think that there's a point which you kind of realize that Enid sees that future. It's like, oh, I'm going to be miserable. And that's, leads to the ending of the movie when she has to get away from everything, So I think that arc is there in both the comic and the film. And I just think maybe the film, because it has to get it done more quickly in a way, it comes off as mean-spirited in the way that the comic doesn't.
Yes. Oh, man. See, that's really interesting because I had a completely different interpretation of the comic.
Okay.
Because I felt like the comic was a story about two people that are wandering aimlessly, and their friendship existed solely because they had nothing else to do.
Yeah.
As soon as Enid decides, hey, I'm going to go to art school, and she kind of throws this whole thing in her friend's face to say, like, yeah, I'm going to leave, and, like, that's going to be the end of our friendship, and I'm sorry, like, you could come with if you want. It was so interesting to see that the dynamic between Becky and Enid was, to me, completely switched in some capacity in the movie versus the comic, because it seems like more in the comic, Enid was kind of this more, for lack of a better phrase, like a shithead character who's like trying to spite people. And in the movie, it seemed like Becky was the one who was insinuating a lot of that stuff. And not to say that Enid was trying to move away from it, but anyways, to get back to my original point, like, to me, it felt like the comic was about two friends drifting apart and how, like, Becky moved on with her life and Enid never did, and Enid just, like, is mad at her about that, like, especially in the final pages of the story. Whereas in the movie, it's kind of more like it's more like Enid's trying to escape, and she makes this choice for herself because other people have moved on. Like, they moved on from her, not like a natural, like, distancing of two friends. Like she had to make the choice to be like, I'm getting the hell out of here. Whereas in the comic, it was like everyone just kind of left her behind, and she was spiteful because of that.
So like, I liked that. I liked that more in the movie, where we had one character. We had Becky, who's, you know, she's trying to grow up, is essentially what we're seeing in the movie. As Becky is trying to, you know, get a job, get an apartment, move on with her life, whereas Enid seems to really want to dig in her heels and just live in that sort of, you know, hateful post high school bubble. And in the comic, it's totally different, like you're saying.
I mean, it was really interesting because I kind of related to that feeling a lot. And I should say not kind of. I 100% related to that feeling. I remembering being like 16, 17, 18 years old and just being like so set in the idea that like, yeah, I'm going to be a rebellious punk and I'm just going to be totally shitty and we're going to, you know, follow people in my car despite how fucking awful and creepy that is, and, you know, go to this diner and just hang out and be rude to the staff. Like, I get that. I totally get that. And yet nowadays I look back at that with like absolute shame and just like, I can't believe how garbage of a person I was when I was 17, you know? I mean, I think that a lot of people have that same feeling, but I totally get that. It's just the difference between what happens in the movie and in the comic, I think, is quite different than what happens in real life, but sort of. I mean, friends drift apart. I really related to that part in the comic, which is why I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, I think that the comic is maybe a better representation of that feeling. You know, the movie, there is a sort of confrontation that the characters have that causes a split, whereas in the comic, there really is just a sense of growing apart. There's nothing that causes the fight or the breakup. It's just like they go in different directions. You're not seeing each other in high school every day, so you naturally sort of drift apart, and that's a pretty common story that I think everyone can relate to. I briefly want to say that I think there is a sense in the movie when they initially contact Seymour, because like, again, Seymour, the Steve Buscemi character, he places the ad in the personal paper, the personal ad. They call him, pretend to be the woman, right? Then they feel real guilty about it. You get that in both the comic and the movie. It might be very brief, but they kind of do feel bad about leading that guy on, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised, you know, rewatching it, because I barely remembered it. I just remember having like just weird feelings about the movie when I had first seen it, and watching them take that little bit of the comic book and expound upon it for almost the whole movie. I thought that was an interesting direction to go, because I think while they did that, and I like that despite that, they still managed to fit in some of the key scenes from the comic. Like, you know, Enid having the garage sale, selling her stuff, and she's like, well, no, I can't sell that stuff. But then, of course, it's cheapened because, Paul, I just want to get on this moment. My small little soapbox. The moment in the comic where Enid is like selling stuff, it's very early on in the story, and Becky's like, what are you doing? Why are you selling this stuff? You're actually going to sell this little action figure weird dude? And she's like, no, that thing's not for sale. And there's this moment of her being like, I don't want to let go of this life that I have. And that's like a clear metaphor to me. In the movie, she goes to this garage sale, this little flea market that's happening at Steve Buscemi's apartment complex, and one of the guys that's there, Steve Buscemi's roommate, does that thing, and then later in the movie, Enid does it, to me, which is like, cheapens the idea that it's not Enid trying to hold on to things, it's that Enid's trying to be like these people that she thinks is really cool, and she wants to be like them, and of course, later in the movie, she realizes that's not what she wants, but regardless, it super cheapened that moment for me. I was so frustrated by it when I was watching the movie.
I didn't have that same reaction, but now you're talking about it, that does make sense. Like, that is... But again, I think that the idea that Enid is trying to find her place in the world, she maybe identifies with these outsiders and losers. Both the movie and the comic, you know, and a lot of Daniel Klaus's work is sort of an obsession with people that seem to be outside of culture and outside of the norm. Enid is trying to, she's play acting to be one of those people where maybe that's not really her authentic self. Like, she's not there yet. You know, she's not a total like loser yet, you know?
And to that point, I mean, I guess I say that moment was cheapened for me because I like the way that it happened in the comic, but I guess to your point, the idea that she's trying to emulate people, like in a way, maybe subconsciously, that she deems as like cool or other or whatever that she wants to be, is an interesting thing. I mean, the whole movie is her trying to find a way to be more like Steve Buscemi's character, and then I think later in the movie, as it's revealed that like he's like, no, my life is fucking awful.
Yeah,
don't be like me.
Exactly.
Yeah. He had the greatest line of when she's trying to set him up with the date, and she's like, well, find somebody who shares your interests. He's like, no, I don't like my interests.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean,
and I just
yeah.
She like coming to that as like a nerd myself, and just being like, I don't know if I'd want to date somebody who is as like stupidly into Star Wars trivia as I am. Like, I don't know if that would work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know I mentioned it earlier, but like the idea that the things that he enjoys ends up kind of making him miserable, and I think that's really interesting. I think the movie introduces this idea that the different characters are engaging with art and pop culture in really different ways. Like Steve Buscemi's character likes authentic jazz music. The scene where they go to the bar to see the blues guy, like that's one of the greatest scenes. I love that scene.
Yeah.
And Blues Hammer has definitely become a shorthand phrase for me to describe a terrible band, because of that scene.
Yeah. Like I love the woman that ends up, Steve Buscemi ends up sitting with for a moment, just like, oh, if you like authentic blues, you're really gonna like this band, and he believes her for a short second, and this band comes on, and it's like lit. The band lit if they tried to like put a bluesy sound to it. Exactly. It's so awful.
It's terrible. And the idea of authenticity comes up, and you can kind of contrast that with the sort of a brief subplot about the cook's chicken and the racist marketing, like that. That I think there's a through line between the idea of that being authentic blues by a bunch of white guys singing about plowing in the cotton field, versus
about plowing in the fucking cotton field. Yeah.
But as I was saying, like his enjoyment that he used to get from that stuff is long gone. You have Enid, who, is obsessed with sort of strange pop culture. There's a sense of nostalgia that she has for stuff she liked as a kid, but it almost feels like it's an ironic distance from it. And then that's contrasted with Ileana Douglas's character, the art teacher, who has such a narrow and shallow view of what art means, and art has to be something. The way those different characters sort of look at art, I think, is really interesting to kind of explore when you watch the movie and what that might mean.
Yeah, I think that the art teacher character definitely brought to the forefront that sort of theme of like everybody is inauthentic,
right?
From the comic. It's definitely present in the comic. You can certainly see it there, but I think it's much clearer when you have this one character who is clearly like everything that she expresses is based around this sort of ideal of art.
Right.
She thinks that art has to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. And of course, this movie managed to get a dig in at comics intentionally, I think, to say, like, Enid has drawn all these drawings of people and things like that, and they're kind of cartoony, and they clearly look like comics. And she's like, this isn't art. What does this mean? She's like, I don't know, I just like Don Knotts. Like,
right, exactly.
Things like that I think anybody nowadays would go, no, that is genuine art. Like, you created it, you spent time, you put passion into it. And I love that she calls it out, because, I mean, in the comic, the dig that we get at comics is more digs at comic creators.
Right.
As Enid is like, my ideal person is Daniel Klaus. I've never seen him before, but I love him. And then they run into him at the zine store. Yeah. And she's like, that dude was a creep.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's, I mentioned it earlier, like I love Daniel Klaus's work, but I find it sometimes hard to read. Because there is such a pessimism to it, but it's also a pessimism that's self-directed. As misanthropic as his comics can be, he almost hates himself more than he hates the rest of the world. It kind of comes through.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is interesting, too, because I think this movie, specifically the comic, because it came out like in the mid-90s, but the movie coming out in 2001, it's like that moment right before the internet kind of homogenized all of pop culture. You could be you have a unique experience. You had to search things out. The idea that she's buying like bootleg tapes from the guy that works at the zine store is a very specific moment in time, right? That's long gone, and I think the movie captures that.
What a sentence, too.
Yes.
Like, there are kids who are going to have no idea what buying bootleg tapes at the zine store means.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just had to get that out.
No, but I think the movie really captures that. Because I was old enough to catch the tail end of that, right before the internet changed everything, not to sound too much like a boomer, I guess, but
it's too late.
I know, before it all changed. But What's interesting is I think, the movie and the comic, even the term ghost world, it's trying to put a finger on that moment right before that, like that there's something is changing and I can't quite put my finger on what it is, and I'm uncomfortable with it, but I don't know how to change it. You know what I mean? Like, I think the movie captures that really well as well, Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the ending of the movie. It's interesting. I never got this until I just rewatched it and kind of did a little bit of research, but a lot of people interpret the ending of the movie when Enid is waiting for the bus and gets on the bus, which apparently, she thought wasn't running anymore. A lot of people interpret that as a metaphor for suicide, which I didn't get initially, but when I rewatched the movie this past week, I kind of like had a brief moment of thinking that. So what do you guys think about that, that interpretation?
Yeah, that definitely occurred to me.
Okay.
Just because, like, we had the old man, I don't remember what his name was.
Norman.
Yeah, we had sad old Norman who was waiting on that bus stop every single day, and he just really seemed like a guy who was on his last days.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so then he got on the bus and left. And so when we see her get on the bus as well, I had that sort of a metaphor for, crossing the river Styx.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow, I am blind to all of this. Holy shit.
Well, I feel like in the comic, that's definitely not.
Right. That's not there.
Possible.
Yeah.
Because they make a comment earlier about, like, oh, they reactivated this bus stop, and that takes any possibility for metaphor out of it.
Yeah. I think I don't want to say one's better than the other. I think one of the reasons I would call this a successful adaptation, is that it isn't a slavish interpretation of the comic onto the screen. The changes that they make benefit a movie more than they would a comic, if that makes sense. And I think they both stand side by side along with each other. You can enjoy both for different reasons. But I do think the ending of the comic is so much more melancholy in a way. It's not as melodramatic. Mm-hmm. She sees Rebecca sitting in the diner by herself, and she just, that comment that Enid makes to herself, "You've certainly grown into a beautiful woman," and it's such a beautiful ending. It's two friends not reconnecting, but still one of them having that realization of that the friendship is done.
Was she sitting by herself, or was she sitting there with the boy?
With Josh, yeah, that's right.
Josh, yeah.
One of my favorite parts of the movie that I loved the first time I watched it, and it still cracks me up, is Josh working at the convenience store and the guy with the mullet with no shirt coming in.
Oh my god!
Because it's not in the comic, but that is the thing. The thing that they do, what's great about the movie is like stuff like that isn't in the story Ghost World, but that is definitely from a Daniel Clowes comic. Like, that character exists in a Daniel Clowes comic. The stuff that they add feels like they just took other parts of 8-Ball and threw it into the movie, to me. So
that's interesting.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, they're definitely, I don't know. This is where I'm very torn on the movie, because I feel like I said, the first 2/3 of this movie I feel like is a really solid reinterpretation, adaptation of the original work, mm-hmm. because it's like you can't necessarily make a series of vignettes like you can in a comic, right? For a movie. So to try to create like some kind of cohesive story, like, you totally can do that. And I think you capture a lot of the feelings of these characters, but it has this 90s vibe of, like, we have to wrap everything up. We have to give a story to everything, and something has to show up. And I like the idea of maybe not knowing what happened to Steve Buscemi's character, or maybe not seeing, like, what happened to, I don't know, Becky after a certain while. Right. Like, she should have just been gone from the movie. Things like that. I would have been really interested to see. Like, I don't think that Steve Buscemi's character and Scarlett Johansson's character should have ever really interacted, because those were, like, Enid was intentionally, like, keeping them apart because that's just how she wanted to live her life. Like, she wanted to have something just for herself. So I don't know. I feel like they went a bit too far in trying to make it wrap up like a movie. I know I already kind of talked about this, but just that's the thing that kind of pulls me away, because again, that feeling that you get out of the comic is so great. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about this for like 2 days straight.
I'm glad.
Like, how much I enjoyed the comic after a while, because I mean, there was some weird racist Nazi shit, like, in the story. Well, that kind of is weird, which I think is maybe a sign of like what he was trying to do is say, like, look at how offensive and awful these women are. But at the same time, it's they had to cut that out for the movie to make it a little bit more PG, despite calling that one guy a Nazi right early on in the movie.
Right. Yeah.
But,
I mean,
yeah, I don't know.
Even with the stuff they cut out, the movie still had a lot of homophobia and slurs and stuff.
Yeah.
Which, like, that's how people talked in the 90s. I'm not...
Yeah, exactly.
That's not a criticism, and more just a comment that, like... And that's the stuff they kept in.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I think that's interesting. The idea of the characters being unlikable is, again, a very common theme in a lot of Daniel Klaus's comics. But at the same time, you find yourself, identifying with them at the same time,
Oh, totally.
So, because, we've all been shitheads in our lives, so, I mean... Right.
That's where I almost disagree.
Okay. Yeah.
Just because I definitely was a shit at some point in my life, don't get me wrong, but I also think that for there also wasn't an interesting story to tell about me at that point in my life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that in order for me to get invested in the story, to really care what's happening in Enid's life, I felt like there had to be something to give me a reason to see her as more than just sort of the one-note a-hole that the movie made her out to be.
Yeah.
So if we had just seen her be really nice to her dad one time, or if she and Becky were never mean to each other, just to everybody else, I think that would have given me a nucleus to kind of grab onto and build empathy around.
Sure.
I struggled.
Her sort of, if you can call it a redemption, her redemption happens so late and is so fleeting in the movie. There's a moment in the comic where she's looking for the record that she had as a kid, the song about with a smile on my face, ribbon in my hair, whatever it is. And that is such a great moment in the comic where she's looking for the record and it sort of magically appears on her turntable. I love that part. They mention that so briefly in the movie. Toward the end of the movie, she is listening to that song and she keeps playing it over and over again, like she was playing the old blues record over and over again. It's almost that moment when she kind of has a fleeting sort of sense of, what am I doing? What happened to my happiness? Where did it go? Did I lose it? Is it my fault? But it happens so fleetingly and so late in the movie that it's hard to see it as a redemption arc, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. Because I like I said, I did like the way that they inserted a lot of bits and pieces from the comic, sometimes out of order, but the order really didn't matter. Just to make sure you got the same vibe. But yeah, that one was kind of surprising that it came so late.
Yeah,
because it is, to me, a crucial part of the end of the story.
Definitely. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the story and the interpretation, or how it translated from the comic to the movie. I kind of want to talk about the aesthetics, because I think that for me is the most successful part of the movie. Really, is that Daniel Klaus has a very idiosyncratic style, and somehow the movie was able to capture that without just treating the comic as a storyboard, which I think a lot of adaptations tend to do. And I think interviews with Zygoff and Klaus, they both have made that point. It's they did not want to do that. They did not want to just throw the comic on the screen as is. They really wanted to make the movie feel like the comic without it, being a direct adaptation, so to speak. So the sense that you get from the comic is on the screen in the way that the scenes last just slightly too long, And I think, Mike, your point about maybe some criticism of the acting, I think that's on purpose to give it that sense. A lot of the lines are delivered sort of, haltingly, or there's a gap between the dialogue when characters are speaking, and I think it's to create that same mood that's there in the comic.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the case, I guess you hit the nail on the head. But I mean, I don't know if I necessarily liked it, because to me, it all played out as really dry and flat.
Sure.
And I understand that's kind of how the characters are. They're giving this really dry sarcasm in some cases.
Yeah.
And in some scenes it works. In others, it feels like they didn't know what to tell the actor to do, so they just said, and action. What am I supposed to do? Just read your lines, dummy. It to me, it felt like there was some misunderstanding as to how some characters were supposed to act.
Yeah.
I remember thinking when I first saw this that Scarlett Johansson is a bad actress. And I mean, I think she's proven since then that she's not necessarily a bad actress. It's just this movie had her portray a character that is very flat.
Yeah.
and maybe that's a testament to how good of an actress she is. I don't know.
Yeah.
But in my head, I just kind of put the other idea of, okay, young actor, indie film, like this is just like a or like strangely put together thing. But then like you switch over and you look at someone like Steve Buscemi, and like that dude's giving it his all, and I totally got the desperation and sadness in his character. Like he just looks exhausted with his life in the movie. And I've seen Steve Buscemi in plenty of other things, and he doesn't look like that all the time. So like I think that there definitely is some serious acting cred going on there. It's still read as very, very dry and not in like a good way in some scenes for me.
I, honestly, very briefly, I want to say, rewatching the movie, I really found myself loving Ileana Douglas's character. I think she's so good in this movie. And she's one of those actresses that you've seen a bunch of stuff, but you never really maybe remember, but she's so good in this movie as that art teacher. But yeah.
It's so pretentious. It's fantastic. I love it.
Yeah, the character is so like such an over-the-top trope of a person, but somehow she makes it work.
Yeah. Yeah.
My favorite. I just want to talk about like that whole art school story arc just really quick.
Yeah.
Because it makes no sense, like outside of the movie, if only because like they all had like all these kids had to go to arts class for the whole summer. Why is that one girl so good at art if she's in like the retake class? That's all that I had to say about it.
Well, yeah, again, I think that borrows heavily from another Daniel Klaus story called Art School Confidential, which is also made into a film, which is somewhat less successful of an adaptation, in my opinion. But he does bring a lot of his autobiographical experiences going to art school into that scene. So that in that story. So it fits. The movie does, the liberties it takes with the story makes sense in the larger sense of Daniel Klaus's work.
Yeah.
And but very briefly, I want to go back to maybe the aesthetics of it, where it's so interesting to watch the movie and read the comic, because I forgot the comic wasn't full color. It's monochromatic. But the movie, they do that thing where they sort of saturate the color so much that it looks almost unreal. And I think it actually sort of works really well in that sense. It captures the look of the movie, even though it is full color. Captures the look of the comic, even though it is in full color, and the comic is not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that the way everything in the movie looks sort of like washed out, almost, and then everything in the book just sort of has like it's black and white with blue shading. Yeah, and I thought that it reminded me in some way of like. You ever been into somebody's bathroom and they have like the harsh white lights in the bathroom and everything looks sort of weird? That was the vibe I got from the entire comic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels like small town Los Angeles somehow. Yeah. Like that's where my head was with the whole thing.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking because Kate and I went on our honeymoon to Denver and some other parts of the Southwest, and I was definitely getting a very strong like the ragged edge of a town like Denver or Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It definitely feels like it's on the fringes of something. And so again, so the characters on the fringes of pop culture and all that stuff. It's all metaphor, guys. It's so metaphorical. But again, that contrast of the idea of authenticity, I love the fact that they go to the original, like, authentic diner, which is run down and doesn't look very pleasant. And then they go to the homogenized, quote unquote 50s style diner, and that's so much like has no soul to it, you know what I mean? And like the way that they contrast those two I think is really interesting, and that kind of plays out throughout the entire movie the way it looks, I think.
Yeah, I loved the 50s diner more in the movie than in the book, because in the book it seemed I don't know shit about old music, but it seemed like they were playing like 50s hits in the diner in the comic, whereas in the movie it was just some like whatever was current pop rap or something like that.
Yeah. That I thought was a strange choice, but it definitely plays up that sense of what the movie's trying to hint at, is like they feel so out of place in contemporary pop culture, but they're not even making an attempt to fit in. I mean, they're miserable because of that. So I think that for me, that is what is successful. Rewatching the movie, I have to agree with you, Mike. I think maybe the last 20 minutes don't quite work that well, in retrospect, but that ending, again, for getting on the bus, I think maybe the comic does it in a more interesting way, but I do think that's a great way to end the movie. And did you guys did you guys catch the post-credit scene? It is a comic book movie. It does have a post-credit scene.
No, I didn't.
I didn't.
Oh, okay. Well, if you watch the entire credits, there's a scene where it's the scene where Steve Buscemi's character gets in the fight with the guy at the convenience store, and he ends up kicking the shit out of the dude. So it's a retake of that scene where Steve Buscemi wins the fight. So,
Oh, really?
yeah, it's actually pretty funny.
Fantastic.
So
That's fantastic.
yeah. I guess maybe to kind of wrap it up here, so I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think for me, as I stated at the top of the show, this is a very successful comic adaptation. And I think it's interesting that I believe this is Terry Zweigoff's first narrative film. He directed the documentary about Robert Crumb a few years before this. So maybe that might be a sense why it kind of feels different, because it's kind of his first attempt to make a conventional plot-driven narrative. Mm-hmm. But all that said, I think the ability that him and Daniel Klaus have to translate the feeling of the comic more or less onto the screen and make a movie that isn't a replacement or a direct adaptation for the comic, it stands alongside it as an interesting story. That to me is the most I want from a comic book adaptation into a film. You know what I mean? Not to replace it or to be a direct translation, but something that you can enjoy equally as much as the original material. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. You know, I think that trying to make a direct, like you mentioned, using the comic as the storyboard, I think that would have been a mistake, because I don't think that would have worked as a film at all. And Mike, you talked about not really liking that, you know, they had to kind of tie everything up. But I don't know if I would have made it through this movie if it had been as disconnected from itself as the comic seemed at times. Mm-hmm. So I think that they did what they had to do to take the story without necessarily like remaining faithful to it, like it was some kind of, you know, holy book or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's definitely some merit in creating something that is a reinterpretation of an existing work, and especially to have the creator involved, right? I mean, like if you look at, you know, the big superhero books, you know, people pick and choose the things that they want to bring into the movies and all that stuff. And what's funny is that I think that exact same thing happened for this movie, but it works really well. Not to say it doesn't work well for superhero movies, but it works really well because it's a totally different type of thing. It's not like bringing in a different power set or a different super suit or something like that. Instead, it's, you know, bringing in specific scenes of the movie that convey the same feeling, but telling a completely different story, all things considered, with the same characters. And I don't think that that's bad. And I think it super works for this movie, because it's not like I feel like these two are, like the comic and the movie are two separate entities that know nothing of each other. Instead, it's they came from the same mind, and they are just two interpretations of the same feeling. And I think that super works as a movie. And it's an impressive thing to see someone make an adaptation that isn't just a one-to-one remake of the comic and still manage to convey, I think, the same message on the whole. I mean, for the most part, I mentioned some of my differences that I had or thoughts about it earlier, but even still, like that idea of not fitting in, that counterculture thing, you know, everything that you've been talking about, I think it works super well, and it's an impressive feat. I'd love to see another movie done in this kind of capacity.
Yeah, and like Seymour is definitely a weirdo that could exist in the Ghost World comic. Like, absolutely.
Yeah, the fact that they were able to take that character who's basically on one page in the comic and make it seem like the same character in the whole movie, like it does it really well. Also, very briefly, I think my favorite line in the whole movie is like when they're at the diner and they're spying on Seymour, and he orders the milkshake, and Thor Birch says, you know, oh my gosh, he's ordered a giant glass of milk. Like that, like for some reason, that's always stuck with me. It's one of my favorite lines of the movie. So yeah. All right, so yeah, guys, thanks for doing this, sitting down chatting with me about Ghost World. I want to know what their listeners think about this movie. If they have other movies they want to hear us talk about, other successful adaptations, please let us know. You know where to find us if you're listening to this. We're all on Twitter. I'm at OhiPolly. Brian's at Brian Head. Mike is at Mike Rapin. The show is at IRCB Podcast. Let us know what you think about this movie club show. We'll see if we can do more of it. It wouldn't exist without the help of the people on Patreon. Thank you for supporting the show and making extra content like this possible. If you want to upgrade your patron amount or want to subscribe to that, you can go to patreon.com/IRCB podcast. And then, of course, if you have any thoughts, comments, suggestions on movies we should talk about, let us know at our email, irsbpodcast@gmail.com. Again, thank you, Brian and Mike, for joining me. Thank you for listening. Until next time, we'll see you at the movies. We'll come up with a better closing.
Get out of here so I can sweep up the popcorn.
Yeah, that's a wrap. Something like
there
that.
There we go. Perfect. Cut.